Why are most buildings still using so much energy? Is it possible to heat or cool a building with a fraction of the energy that standard buildings use? Of course, there are concepts out there, and one of these concepts, and one of my favorite concepts, is the Passivhaus concept. The Passivhaus standard is the standard for energy efficient buildings that is based on very highly insulated building fabrics, as well as airtightness and efficient building services. And the good news is, the Passivhaus is still a much more comfortable building than a standard building. The first principle of the Passivhaus, the insulation. If you're based in a cooler climate or if it's winter time, then the perfect insulation helps to keep the warmth inside of the building and not lose it to the outdoors. So you don't need to heat as much because it's all staying in basically. If you live at a hot climate or if it's summertime, the insulation layer also helps to keep the cooler air inside cool and not having it heated up by the hotter outdoor air. But how do we reach that insulation layer? Here it's important to insulate all around the building. So we have insulated walls, insulated roof, we have very energy efficient windows, and also the doors need to be optimized. Plus we need to insulate the floor, of course, and we also need to optimize all the thermal bridging. So all the connection points that could lose some energy are important, and this also leads to high construction quality because everything is checked and all will be better than in a standard building. By improving the airtightness of the building, we make sure that the building keeps its temperature steady and that we're not losing any energy into the environment. Another principle of passive houses is the shading. In summertime, if the sun is shining inside the building, it will heat up the buildings. And that will also lead to higher energy consumption because people tend to use air conditioning to cool it down again. But if you keep out the energy of the sun already in the first place, then you don't need to cool down the building as much as if the sun would enter it. So that's a very important principle of the Passivhaus, to keep the building cooler by shading it. Usually we have shading that is movable and that can only be used once it's necessary. So in winter time, in cooler climate, for example, we want the sun to heat up the building, but in summertime we want to leave it outside. Now the third big principle of the Passivhaus is to keep the temperature steady. And this is usually done by a thermal recovery. So in winter time, if the building is heated and it's warm inside, you have the thermal recovery of that indoor air, which is then heating up or preheating the external air that is coming inside the building. And the good news for anyone who's having allergies is that usually this outdoor air will be filtered before it enters the building and will therefore be very clean. It also leaves out any particular matter, so you have clean and fresh indoor air, which is nicely preheated to be most comfortable for you. In hotter climate, of course, it works the other way around. Another smaller principle of passive houses is to use solar heat gains wherever possible. So for example, to heat up your hot water tank. It's also used to preheat the house in winter time by optimizing the passive house windows to the southern direction for the northern hemisphere, where the sun then enters the building and heats it up. And of course, having windows to the south then leads to having the need for shading in summertime. At the beginning, the passive house was designed, and that's how the name came from. Passive house was designed to have no active heating or cooling system. That has changed over the time because of comfort considerations, but the basic principles stayed the same. The basic principle is to save as much energy as possible and to do it at the lowest cost possible. Usually it's not more expensive to build a passive house compared to a standard building, just because the upfront cost might be slightly higher, but the energy savings over the lifetime are so huge that basically passive house buildings pay off after a few years already. Passive house buildings are not always newly constructed buildings. There are also a lot of examples of old buildings refurbished into passive house buildings.